Okay, now that we've basically set up some of the taxes and various acts that have been passed on the American colonists at this point, we're going to kind of actually start what ignites to becoming the American Revolution. So we will formally or eventually formally secede or break away and declare our independence on July 4th, 1776. So we're going to get through all this material and talk about our declaration, why we do this, how we go about it, and also some of the major battles, losses, and victories that we have during the American Revolution. Okay, although part of the slide is cut off, just kind of bear with me. So after the bloodshed at Lexington and Concord, pretty much the war is on. They're going to be outnumbered oftentimes, outnumbering the British, because they're kind of in the seeds of unrest at that point. Massachusetts and Boston, as its major port city, is pretty much where a lot of the seeds of the American Revolution are planted. But shortly after that, they form, as I mentioned before, they had the First Continental Congress. Now they're going to meet again in 1775, May 10th in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. And at this point, they still don't have really necessarily any intentions of completely leaving the British Empire. Basically, a way of continue fighting this situation and hopefully get the king to give in to their grievances or their list of complaints. So it sends another list of grievances to the Parliament at this point, also measures to raise money for a military and to try and create a navy because we don't really have one. They also select at this point George Washington as their commander of the army, which is very important at this point. He never really risen above the rank of colonel. Largest command was only 1,200 men, but he was a very good leader, and many of the people thought that he would help unite the colonists and perhaps go on to create a lot of victories. He's got a lot of patience, courage, self-discipline, all this kind of stuff, and he also even throws in some of his own money, which shows that he's truly invested in this, adding up more than $100,000 of his own money for the war effort. And we're going to show you just a short clip that I'm going to add in that shows his nomination process. Okay, I seem to have run into some issues, so if you could just pull up YouTube, and if you go into the search engine and look for George Washington nominated as the commander of the Continental Army, there's a short 5-minute clip there. You can supplement that to kind of show slightly the reluctance, perhaps, of George Washington to take this position, but also his humble mentality once he's granted that. That's just supplemental, so if you want to do that, you can just kind of watch that on your own through YouTube. Okay, as it states here, we've tried to rally some troops and create some leadership. So in the first year, the war was one of consistency as the colonists maintained their loyalty while still shooting at the king's men. We're going to have some events like the Green Mountain Boys, Ethan Allen, Benedict Arnold, which show a little bit of their ability to surprise and capture some key forts and so forth, like Ticonderoga and Crown Point. Don't forget about Benedict Arnold. He's going to switch sides, as we know. But we're relatively low on resources, so it's pretty important that we raid these places and capture these gunpowders and cannons and so forth. And then in 1775, you're going to have the colonists, the colonials, seizing Bunker Hill, which had been known as Breed's Hill, and pretty much outflanking. Instead of flanking the Redcoats, they launched a frontal attack, which is oftentimes really stupid. But if you have numbers, sometimes you can win. But after Bunker Hill, basically George III is going to pretty much stop any hopes of compromise between him and the colonials and reconciliation. So now they're basically an open rebellion. And then that's when he starts sending in more mercenaries, those Hessians that he will use, which oftentimes came for pay rather than loyalty to the king at that point, which they're under German descent. So oftentimes they had no loyalty whatsoever to the British Army. Just their paycheck. Okay, next is kind of going to be the hopes of perhaps invasion of Canada at this point. So in October of 1775, so we're getting towards the end of 1775, the British are going to burn some key places like Falmouth, which is Portland, Maine at this point. And they kind of make a bad call. They decide to try to invade Canada in hopes of actually adding a 14th colony and deprive a pretty strong base. You're going to see there's a lot of loyalists that remained in Canada, but this pretty much runs foul. Things fall apart, and we're just going to kind of move on because then they're going to start focusing a little bit more on protecting themselves at home while the British start creating a different plan and strategy. But just know that they tried to do that, and they had to abort that because of a lot of failures in that effort. Okay, we also got to remember at this point that only about a third of the colonists supported revolution. The other third is kind of for the loyalist side, and the last third as we'll find out, is kind of sitting on the fence. So in 1776, in January of that year, Thomas Paine publishes his famous pamphlet, was known as Common Sense, and basically pushes and urges the colonists to kind of take a side, and perhaps take the side of revolution in this point, and join the war effort. He argues it in very common language. He tries to excite the people with emotion, and he also tries to use language that most everyone would be able to read. So he argues that nowhere in the universe did a smaller body control a larger one. So a tiny island nation 3,000 miles away telling a whole continent what to do is kind of crazy. He attacks the king here, but it works very well. He creates a lot of imagery and a lot of analogies, and he creates the analogy that the colonies are children and England is the mother or the parent, but the colonies are mature now and they need to break away, and this is an insistence on everyone to join arms and help fight for this cause. Another thing that he argues for is the idea of a republic, where you select representatives as your government, which would honestly appeal to a lot of those common people who read this pamphlet. So you'd have representation through senators and governors. Their power comes from the consent of the people, not given by God, as it was expected through this idea of divine right theory that a lot of the people held. His ideas about rejecting monarchy and empire, embrace independent republic, fell on receptive ears in America. A lot of those people who were tired of the status quo really kind of adhered to this and bought into it. And a lot of the people in New England already had this idea with their town meetings. And some of the patriots, though, favored a republic ruled by a natural aristocracy. And sometimes you'll even see people like Thomas Jefferson, rather, arguing that certain people are just naturally able to lead and should kind of take that role. So adding to Thomas Paine's Common Sense, Thomas Jefferson goes on to kind of promote and write later on our explanation for our Declaration of Independence. So eventually when we met with the Second Continental Congress, they start making moves towards trying to make a clean break. So on June 7th, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia adopts his resolutions and pushes these things forward. Later, they're kind of debated on for about a month, and then they try to finally adopt a formal plea for this. And then Thomas Jefferson is a great writer. He's going to be the one who's responsible for editing and creating this document, and list of grievances against the king, persuading and explaining why the colonies are doing this, because if they don't give a formal declaration, they're basically just in rebellion, as the king has already said. So this is a way to formally break away and perhaps get foreign support as well. So it's an explanation of independence. It talks about natural rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which are basically plagiarizing John Locke at this point, you could argue. So he uses that idea of the social contract theory of natural rights to kind of enunciate, or rather to explain why they're breaking away. It later gets approved, and July 4th, this officially becomes our declaration of severing our ties with the English Empire. Okay, and as I've alluded before, this isn't necessarily a popular war. Some people were sitting pretty comfortably. Some people had it made. Those are usually going to be the loyalists, and the patriots are the ones who are fighting for revolution at this point. So it's a war within a war. There were patriots who supported rebellion. They're also going to be called Whigs. So that term, don't forget about it. It's going to come back later when we talk about a political party coming around in the 1830s and 40s. There were loyalists, as I mentioned before, who supported the king and didn't necessarily adhere to these ideas. They're going to be called Tories. And then there's moderates who are on the fence trying to figure out either way. So during the war, the British proved that they can only control the Tory areas, and that's going to be a lot of times found in the South, in the port cities. That's generally where they have the most success. And then in the interior, that's where you're going to find a lot of the patriots or those moderates. And then in New England, that's where you're going to have the stronghold, oftentimes, of those patriot militias and so forth. So the patriots were generally the younger generation, Sam Adams, Patrick Henry. Oftentimes, they didn't belong to the Anglican or Church England. They were rather Congregationalist or Presbyterian and so forth. So there's a lot of ideological things that are different. And then you've got these situations where the Tories or Loyalists often associated with the Anglican Church, and it's strong in the South. So you can see that there's even a war within a war going on at this point. Oftentimes, for fear of their lives and the explanation through the Declaration of Independence, a lot of these Loyalists basically just packed up and left. Sometimes their lands were sold by patriots to raise money for the war effort, so around 50,000 loyalists actually served for the British in one way, either fighting or spying or supplying them with weapons. And they probably could have been a lot more beneficial if the British had acknowledged them earlier and used them more in the war effort. And in here you see a political cartoon kind of depicting the loyalists or views from England on what's going on, of what would happen to these loyalists, and it's kind of making them look as if they're kind of savages and so forth. And you can see as we zoom in some of the wording. And then the Americans are being depicted as well as the British, and kind of what's going on back home, and kind of this idea of the savage and the fate of the loyalist if we don't come to their aid, so that kind of stuff. So political cartoons were even circulating back then.